In a few minutes, you're going in to see what I think is one of the finest collections of Egyptian antiquities ever to travel the United States. Better, in fact, than the previous two Tutankhamun exhibits that came here to Seattle, one in the, I think, 1950s and the other in the, whenever it was, late 70s, early 80s. Better because it is more representative of more periods of Egyptian art. I'm not going to talk about that exhibit. You're going to discover it for yourself in a few minutes, and I want to move on to something else. But let me just point out one thing. The galleries in the exhibition, and I believe there are 10 of them, are not arranged chronologically. They are arranged topically. So in the first gallery, for example, you will see representations of Egyptian pharaohs, and in the second gallery, representations of Egyptian nobility and members of royal families, and in the third gallery, representations of gods and so forth, before finally you get to the collection of Tutankhamun. This is an opportunity to see all periods of Egyptian art, from the earliest periods in the Old Kingdom around 2700 BC to more recent materials as recent as 700, 800 BC. It's a good opportunity to see the breadth of Egyptian art, and if you pay attention to the nuanced differences between the pieces of sculpture and the other objects, and the differences in technology, for example, in the jewelry, I think you'll be very impressed and informed by the way in which a culture that is supposed to have been changeless for 3,000 years did in fact change over time and sometimes change very dramatically. What I'd like to do in the next few moments is to give you a bit of background on that material. It comes from several archaeological sites in Egypt, but most of it comes from here. Ancient Thebes, modern Luxor, a village that lies about 350, 400 miles south of modern Cairo on the Nile. The East Bank, at the bottom right of the slide, the site of modern Luxor city and the site of ancient Thebes, the town, and the temples of Karnak and Luxor. My concern right now is with the other side of the river, the west bank of the Nile, because it was here that in antiquity, the pharaohs of Egypt's New Kingdom, a period of about 500 years, from 1500 BC to 1000 BC, made their preparations for the afterlife. Now, those preparations involved two basic kinds of structures. They built a tomb, and they also built a mortuary temple or a memorial temple in which their spirit could be celebrated both at the time of the funeral and in years subsequent to it. Because of the geography of Thebes, the mortuary temple and the tomb were separate from one another. The temples lie along the edge of the cultivation. You don't want to build tombs there because the groundwater is too high, and it's certainly not going to allow things to be preserved. And so the tombs are off in the hillside, the limestone hills beyond to the west. Every king, as far as we know, in the New Kingdom, built a temple and a tomb in this area. I know you can't read the labels on this, but the yellow area is the edge of the desert adjacent to the cultivation, and wherever you see a line of text is the name of one of those memorial temples. These temples are an integral part of the ancient funeral ceremony because when an individual pharaoh died, his body was taken by a boat down the Nile, or up the Nile as the case may be, and across channels cut through the agricultural land to his memorial temple, where services were performed, prayers uttered, before the body was then carried overland in a procession up to the Valley of the Kings, at nearly the top center of the slide. The memorial temples are perhaps less well known than the tombs themselves, but they're no less impressive. In fact, some of them are huge. This is the temple of Ramses III, called Medinet Habu today. A huge complex, a large stone temple surrounded by mud brick storerooms, stables, palace buildings, priests' quarters, kitchens, you name it, everything necessary for the regular performance of ceremonies, not just for Pharaoh, but for the various gods with whom he was going to be allied in the afterlife. The temples are wonderful sources of information. They tell us a great deal about Egyptian religion and funerary beliefs, but all those mud brick buildings around are filled with remains, papyri and texts and ostraca that tell us a great deal about the lives of the priests, the lives of the temple officials, and indeed the lives of the pharaohs themselves. Unfortunately, most of these temples, like most of the monuments in Egypt, are falling apart. This is due in part to the fact that for several hundred years, Europeans have treated the temples as archaeological cornucopias, a place where you could go and cart away monuments to your heart's content, knowing full well that you could come back the next season and find plenty more. Egypt would never be exhausted. The antiquities would never run out. That's why it was possible to come in the early 1900s with 500 workmen, set them to work, the archaeologist setting up a tent away from the dust, saying, if you workmen, while you're digging, find anything of gold, come and bring it to me and I'll pay you its value, the weight of the gold. If you find anything else, well, if it's a whole pot, bring it to me. If it's a broken pot, don't bother. The result, of course, is that the archaeological materials that were collected in the 19th dynasty and early 20th dynasties, materials that now fill huge galleries in museums around the world, are very selective and represent a very small percentage of what archaeologists, or let's be fair, let's call them tomb robbers or grave diggers, actually uncovered. There are other problems in the protection of the monuments as well, more modern problems. Groundwater from agriculture. Since the building of the Aswan Dam, the annual Nile flood no longer occurs, and instead we have a system in Egypt of flood irrigation, where fields are filled with water for months at a time, water 6 inches deep. That groundwater raises the level of water all along the edge of the cultivation, destroying the foundations of the temples, some of which you can see there. That's the Ramesseum, the temple of Ramses II, causing the foundations of the temple to weaken and its walls to collapse. Worse, there's no better place in the world than Luxor to grow sugarcane. Sugarcane requires even more water than most crops, and after it's been harvested, most farmers prefer burning the sugarcane fields in order to return vital nutrients to the soil. But this burning produces a very acrid smoke that causes the stone of which the temples are made to be destroyed, the paint on the walls of the temples to crumble to dust. It's a nightmarish situation. Our project has been actively engaged in trying to relocate many of these temples. They're not all like Medinet Habu. They're not all well preserved. Many of them are tiny and small places. Just below in this slide, there's a little mound. It looks like an English muffin with all kinds of holes in it. That actually is a hill under which is the burial temple, the mortuary temple of Tutankhamun. It was only partially excavated about 50 years ago, still hasn't been fully explored. But in the last 50 years, agricultural land has been moving westward into the archaeological zone, raising the groundwater, further destroying monuments. And excavations in future years, whenever somebody gets around to it, of the memorial temple of Tutankhamun are going to find a temple much less well preserved than it was even a few decades ago. This is the temple of Amenhotep I, one of the first temples to have been built in Egypt by for one of the first kings of the New Kingdom. It's in the parking lot of an alabaster factory, and you can see practically nothing remains. There's the base of a column over on the right-hand side of the slide, and that's about it. Our project has been using various geophysical devices to try and relocate the remains of these temples. We found more than 30 or 40 of them, and see if we can't better protect them. We've also been using the material to generate computer-driven reconstructions of what the temples look like. Since many of the temples follow fairly standard patterns, they change, but in minor detail, it's possible for us on the basis of the magnetometric surveys to get an idea of what the plan is, and from that to reconstruct the walls and the pylons and so forth. Eventually, we hope that we'll better be able to protect these monuments and at the same time allow agriculture to continue, because after all, it is one of the main ingredients in the economics of Upper Egypt. But also, I think we'll be better able to reconstruct what life in ancient Thebes might have been like, and to reconstruct the temples in such a way that they will become a tourist destination, bringing more people into Thebes, important for the economy, but at the same time providing other places than the Valley of the Kings for those tourists to visit, thereby lessening the pressures on the monuments in the valley. This is the Valley of the Kings itself, as it looked in 1906. Where this little cliff is in the foreground, that's been cut away, and that's the road that you now drive up in little jitneys to get to the valley from the parking lot nearby. The Valley of the Kings consists of a series of small tombs. You usually go down a staircase into a small chamber with a sarcophagus of stone in the center. The walls decorated with religious scenes designed to ensure the safe journey of Pharaoh from this life into the next, and his union with the gods, an important point, because once the king gets there, he can talk directly to the gods and make known to the gods what you and I, we ordinary mortals, require for our happy existence. The tombs were important to get the king to the next life, important to provide the texts and scenes that would have him talk to the gods on our behalf, and important to preserve the materials that he needed for survival in the afterlife. His body, wine, bread, beer, all the offerings that were made and placed in the tomb were put here in order to survive, in theory, for an eternity. Unfortunately, the tombs are also elegantly decorated, beautifully, beautifully painted. This is the tomb of Ramses VI. Huge series of rooms and corridors covered with scenes of religious texts. Generically, we can call them the Book of the Dead, although there are about 20 different texts serving different religious functions in them. These, unfortunately, are suffering today, like those memorial temples are suffering, because of numerous factors. Theft used to be a problem. Vandalism used to be a problem. Those are no longer serious threats. What is serious today is the fact that they're so popular. When I first went to the Valley of the Kings in 1963, I was one of about 10 people that day to visit the valley. If you went in the days before the revolution, 18 months ago or so, there would have been 5,000 people in the Valley of the Kings. Today, in spite of the revolution and in spite of a drop in tourism, there are still 6,000 or 7,000 tourists coming to the Valley of the Kings. Mostly Eastern European tourists who are coming as day trippers from their Red Sea vacations, who come in the morning, visit the Valley of the Kings, turn around, and then go back to the Red Sea, but who, during the few hours they're here, generate a lot of pressures on the monument. Pressures, rising humidity caused by their sweating bodies, rising temperatures in the tomb caused by their sweaty bodies. Temperature and humidity changes up and down, if they're rapid enough, cause the paint to deteriorate, the plaster on which the paint is applied to turn almost to a chocolatey mush and fall to the ground, and the limestone behind it to exude naturally occurring salts, which cause further deterioration of the surface. Our project has been very active in trying to figure out ways of preventing the deleterious impact of tourists on these monuments. We can't stop tourism. It's too important to the economy of Egypt. It's the single most important source of foreign income. But what we can do is to develop management plans for the Valley of the Kings that will allow us to control that tourism in a way that will allow the monuments to survive for future generations. We began doing this, almost 40 years ago now. We founded the Theban Mapping project, and our first chore was to make a map of the area, a topographic map and an archaeological map, because we reasoned if you couldn't tell where the objects were you wanted to protect, there's no way you could protect them. And so we did elaborate topographic surveys of the entire Theban area, with an emphasis on the Valley of the Kings. In the process, we were able to trace the development of the tombs in the valley. Here, tombs from the early New Kingdom, the Middle New Kingdom, the Late New Kingdom, or to put it technically, the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th dynasties, show how the tombs evolved in plan. priests decided to make changes in the design of the tombs because the plan of the tomb was in effect a roadmap to get the pharaoh from this life to the next. And the scenes on the walls of the chambers were in effect a guidebook telling him what he could expect along the way. In the process of our work, we also found, looking at historical photographs and journals of early travelers, we uncovered what we can only call, I guess, lost tombs, tombs that had gone missing. We found several of them. Here in the picture on the left is a photograph taken by Howard Carter's photographer at the time they were digging, looking for the tomb of Tutankhamun, or looking for tombs and finding the tomb of Tutankhamun. It would lie, they would discover the tomb a few days after this slide was taken, this photo was taken, in the lower right-hand portion of the photo. But you can see Carter's workmen carrying buckets of dirt away from the excavation in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, off to the left-hand part of the slide. And they are dumping it on a hillside there, at the base of which there is a covered area where tourists would park their donkeys to provide shade for the animals while the tourists went in to visit the tombs. Well, one of the tombs that we had seen referred to in early texts was a tomb that we thought lay on the very hillside that Howard Carter buried under another 6 feet of limestone chips and sand. This is what it looked like on the right when we started our excavations. And lo and behold, in only a few days of clearing along the base of the hillside, we rediscovered a tomb, the entrance to which had in fact been seen in 1822 by an English traveler. Nobody had gone into the tomb and explored it, nobody knew much about it, but over the next few months, we decided we would try and find the extent of the tomb so we could include it on the Valley of the Kings map we were drawing. We began digging in the tomb chambers, and it was extremely difficult work. The tomb was filled, chock-a-block, with muck and debris that had washed down from the hillsides around the valley. Maybe every 50, 75, 100 years you get torrential rainstorms in the Valley of the Kings. And they wash hundreds of tons of debris down the cliffs and down the hillsides and over the cliffs, and it comes racing down the valley floor. And of course, it is in the valley floor that the entrances to these tombs are dug. And so all of this debris is pushed into the tombs, where it comes at 30 miles an hour, boulders sometimes the size of watermelon, racing into the tomb, doing damage to anything in its path, the walls of the tomb, the objects in the tomb, whatever. And then over 1,000 or 2,000 years, it slowly dries to the consistency of concrete. And our workman on the left, using a 14-pound sledgehammer, is trying to dig through that cement-like matrix to clean out the tomb chamber. At the same time, we have 2 or 3 people watching him because embedded in that matrix are antiquities, objects, pieces of pottery. We found over 980,000 pieces of pottery so far, every one of which we've washed, labeled, studied. We found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of objects. I'm not going to show them to you. I could. I'm proud of them, but believe me, they pale in contrast to what you're going to see in a few minutes. So enjoy those. Take my word for it. These are nice too. Using pickaxes to dig the debris out, we still have to sift it to make sure we don't miss anything, and it's very slow going, very meticulous work indeed. But in the process, we found a tomb unlike any tomb ever found before in the Valley of the Kings, with long corridors and doorways off the corridor, multiple doorways, side chambers going off in every direction. This corridor leading to, at the end, a representation nearly life-size of the god Osiris, if you can call the statue of a god life-size. It doesn't work very well, but you know what I mean. Anyway, this is the quintessential god of the afterlife, Osiris, or more correctly, I guess, it's Ramses the Great, Ramses II, represented as the god Osiris, who is standing there looking out over the people who are buried in this tomb. Who are they? Why is he protecting them? Well, because we know from the texts on the wall of the tomb that they include the sons of Ramses II. He was a prolific man. He had over 40 sons, whose names we know. Undoubtedly, he had many more than that. He had 40 sons by principal wives. He had secondary wives and tertiary wives and concubines and all the rest of it, and he probably fathered many more children than that. But there were at least 40 sons, and we have 20 representations of sons in our tomb. There could be that many of his sons buried here. Or there are 4 names in the tomb. There could be 4 sons buried here. There are 4 mummies or skeletal materials of mummies in the tomb, again suggesting that maybe 4 sons are here. Who were they? They were the principal sons of the king. They were the heirs apparent to the throne who predeceased their long-lived father and were buried in this tomb because they held such important positions of power in their lifetime. This may be the firstborn son of Ramses II, Amenhotep. If it is, and you accept the biblical story of the Exodus, and you believe that Ramses II is the pharaoh of the Exodus, then here he is, the firstborn son. The tomb we found is unlike any other tomb ever found in Egypt. The yellow tomb, which was carved later above it, is the tomb of Ramses IX, and it looks like most of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, a long syringe-like tomb. I call it a syringe because that's the way the Greeks described it. The tombs were long tubes cut into the bedrock, into the hillside. Look at the blue tomb. That's us. That's KV5, Kings Valley Tomb number 5. We've designated it. It's not a syringe-like tomb at all. It's rather like the tentacles of an octopus going off in every which direction. And I must say that this drawing is incomplete because since it was made, we have been finding more corridors and more chambers, and the tomb gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the inset in the upper left-hand corner indicates the new chambers that we found year before last. I don't have a more recent slide of our drawings, but this last season, April and May of this year, we found another set of corridors that would allow us to draw another inset, like this one, of more chambers. Most tombs in the Valley of the Kings have 6, 7, 8, 9 chambers. You saw that little video of a typical tomb. It had only 3 chambers. This tomb has 130 chambers and still counting. The tomb of Tutankhamun covers approximately 60 cubic yards in size, occupies 60 cubic yards of space. This occupies approximately 4,000. It's the largest tomb ever found in the Valley of the Kings, one of the largest, if not the largest tomb ever found in Egypt. And we're going to be here a long time digging it out because the debris is really tough to get through. Exactly what the history of the tomb is, I can't tell you. Hopefully that will be able to be the subject of another lecture some years down the line. In the process of doing this, we've been very concerned about protecting the Valley of the Kings as a whole. And this has become a major part of the Theban Mapping Project's work. We've been building flood control devices in front of the tomb so that if there is another flash flood, water will be deflected away from the tomb entrance and will not enter the tomb and do damage. There was another flood, by the way, in 2004. It did damage to the tomb of Tutankhamun and several other tombs in the Valley of the Kings because such simple little things as building little walls around the entrance had not been put in place. We're also putting down soil treatment to minimize the amount of dust in the valley and to waterproof the surface so any floodwaters that do get into the valley can go directly through the valley and down the road beyond it without doing any damage in the interval. We've been putting in a new electrical generator to replace this one on the left. We've been inaugurating a new trash system to replace that one on the right. We put in new signage in the Valley of the Kings, giving tourists an opportunity to look before they go into a tomb, see an isometric drawing of the tomb, photographs of its highlights, and a brief text indicating its date and its importance. And we are doing something else that as an archaeologist when I was a student at UW, I never thought I would be doing. We have been spending a lot of time designing toilets. Because when you get 8,000 tourists a day in Egypt, 4,000 of whom are probably suffering jippy tummy, this is a very important consideration. We have replaced the old tram line on the left with a new non-polluting electrical one on the right. It's already made a big difference. There's no noise pollution, there's no smoke pollution, no vibration. It's certainly been a welcome change in the valley. We've installed a visitor center working with the government of Japan. They paid for it, we designed it. A visitor center that provides information for tourists before they go into the valley, giving them a potted history of it, telling them who the various gods are that they will encounter in the reliefs, who the kings are and what their chronology is. We have reconstructions of the geology of the valley and so forth. And here we have a comfortable shaded place where the local villagers can sell their wares, their postcards and their fake antiquities and so forth to tourists. We can't not have that. The local economy depends on it. For many people on the West Bank, this is their only source of income. But we can provide a place that is more aesthetically attractive than what there used to be. We've had training courses to convince the local villagers that hassling tourists is not profitable, that they would do better being nice and laid back and quiet, and they're beginning to adopt that, and their income is coming up. They're convinced of it. So it's a pleasant change for the tourist and a pleasant change for the Egyptian local as well. We've also been extensively photographing. We now have complete photographic coverage of all of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the first time this has ever been made possible. And the photographs that we have are detailed photographs of every decorated wall in every accessible tomb. All of this material, by the way, is up on our website, thebanmappingproject.com or kv5.com or kentweeks.com or .edu or .org. It's all there. It's the most visited archaeological site on the internet. We get 1 million hits a month. And one of the reasons is it's not only comprehensive in scope, but it's fun to use. For the Egyptologist, this is one of its most useful attributes. Complete photographs of every wall of every tomb, and these photographs are ZUMA-fiable. You can zoom in and not just look at a photograph like this, a general section of a wall, but you can look closely enough to see the artist's brush strokes as he tried to indicate the feathers on the wing of a small quail chick. It's been very, very well received by our colleagues. We've taken the old fluorescent bulbs that lighted the tombs, bulbs that just lay on the dust-covered floor, and are replacing them with LED lighting and putting in temperature and humidity controls and dust controls to make the visitor experience more pleasant, but also to minimize damage to the tomb and its paintings because of bad lighting and dust and heat and so on. And we're developing extensive plans to control the number of tourists so they don't have to stand in the sun 110 or 120 degrees in the shade for an hour to get into a tomb. And that, in turn, is beneficial to the tomb itself. By enhancing the visitor experience, we think we make the tomb safer. By controlling tourism, we think we make the tomb safer. And our site management plan, the first one ever designed for any tomb in Egypt, any archaeological site in Egypt, will be published at the end of the year. The Arabic version of it will be published also at the end of the year, and it's the first monument in the Middle East, the first archaeological site in the Middle East to have an extensive management plan published for it. One other thing we are doing, and this is for the long term, not the short term. In our office on the West Bank, we have established a library, mostly in Arabic, but also in English and some French and some German. There is no such library available to tour guides or members of the Antiquities Organization who are charged with protecting these monuments for them to go and do reading or research in. This library provides a resource for all of the people involved with the archaeological monuments where they can come and learn and better their knowledge and the ability to apply that knowledge to the tombs and the monuments at Thebes. But we decided if we're going to do this, why not go the whole way? And we have actually converted it into what, in effect, is a small public library. And it's one of the things I'm proudest of, I must admit. We have books here that cover everything from prenatal care and proper diet for pregnant women and young children to motorcycle repairs and air conditioning and the building of mud brick vaults and all this sort of thing. We have books on every aspect of history. We have a huge children's book section, all of it in Arabic. We have each day now, we're open from 3 to 10 each day. Egyptologists, tour guides, and so forth come in and use the library from 5 to 10, but from 3 to 5 it's open for kids. And children from schools come in. We have a woman, a school teacher, who is there along with our regular male librarian, and the reason for that is we want to encourage young women to come, and there has to be a woman there, or their fathers or their brothers or their husband would not be very happy. But they come, they have books that they can read, and women have been given really short shrift in the educational system in Egypt. The literacy rate in Egypt is rising, but the literacy rate among young women in Egypt is dropping. It's gone from 85% under the latter years of Sadat to about 70%. We're trying to remedy that. We've made a clean, well-lighted place for books where people in the local villages can come. Teachers are bringing students who are having reading difficulties. We're offering remedial classes. And we just got a wonderful gift from a group of French college students who were out in Egypt on a study tour who saw our library. One of them had a friend who had met a family in Egypt, and the family had a blind child. He went back to France and collected a whole series of books in Arabic Braille. So we now have a Braille library, and there are half a dozen blind children in the Luxor area who are now able to come in once a week, and they are reading books, including books on the history of ancient Egypt. Now, this is a long-term solution to the problem of protecting the monuments, because by educating the people who live around those monuments, and by educating the people who deal directly with the monuments, we're, I think, doing more than we could do in any other way to ensure that 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, these people are going to play a significant role in protecting those monuments. And that's the whole purpose of our project. Not simply to dig a tomb like KV5, which is exciting. That is really gung-ho, Indiana Jones kind of archaeology. I don't mean to denigrate it. It's a very educational and important historical discovery. But the protection of the monuments here is equally important. And I would hate our generation to have gone down in history as the people who are looked upon by future generations as, they say of us, why, when you knew the problems, why didn't you try and solve them? We're trying to solve them. We're trying to develop management plans for Thebes that will guarantee the protection of what I think is one of the most beautiful and important archaeological sites in the world. And having said that, and you look at this huge hillside that covers about 5 square miles, keep in mind that although it is already one of the largest archaeological sites anywhere on Earth, I don't think we have excavated yet 15% of what is there. Are there more discoveries to be made? You bet there are. But the most important thing is protecting what we've already dug up. What have we dug up? Well, you're just about to find out by going out there and going into a collection of Egyptian antiquities that really is second to none. You're really blessed to have such a lovely collection here, and doubly blessed to be able to go in and see it on your own. Enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.